On the morning of November 17, 1928, inside a private dining room on the fourth floor of the Lexington Hotel in Chicago, Al Capone sat alone, waiting. Not for an enemy, not for a politician, not for a rival Italian boss, but for a meeting that should never have been possible. The Lexington Hotel was Capone's headquarters, his fortress. Every hallway was watched, every employee was paid, every room could become a trap or an escape route at a moment's notice. By 1928, Capone was 29 years old and at the absolute height of his power. His bootlegging empire generated more than $100 million a year. He'd survived assassination attempts, bombings, and gang wars that had turned Chicago into a battlefield. He was the most powerful gangster in America and the most hunted. Violence had made him rich. Violence had made him famous. But violence had also created a problem it could no longer solve. Because the man Capone was waiting for did not belong in this building, did not belong in this room, and, according to every rule of American society, both legal and criminal, should never have been allowed past the front door. This was segregated America, an era when racial lines were absolute, when most hotels in Chicago would not serve black guests, when white criminal organizations controlled the underworld and black gangsters were expected to survive on scraps or be crushed. Yet on this morning, Capone had ordered his men to grant safe passage. No weapons, no tricks, no violence, just a conversation. What made this meeting dangerous wasn't only the threat of murder, it was the threat of exposure. Because if word ever got out that the most powerful white gangster in America was negotiating with black criminals, it would shatter the carefully maintained racial order that both society and the underworld depended on to function. This deal was never written down. No contracts, no witnesses, no paper trail. And for more than 40 years, everyone involved protected that silence. Not out of loyalty, but because revealing it would have destroyed reputations, alliances, and an entire criminal system built on the illusion of separation. In that room sat a man who controlled Chicago, and walking toward that room was a man whose name history would almost erase. A man sent from Harlem with a proposition so audacious it bordered on suicide. A man who understood that if this conversation went wrong, his body would never be found. What happened over the next 3 hours would quietly reshape American organized crime. It would reduce violence, stabilize empires, and create an understanding between white and black criminal organizations that would last for decades. When that man finally walked back out of the Lexington Hotel, he would no longer be just another gangster. He would be protected, connected, and for the rest of his life, nearly untouchable. To understand why that meeting at the Lexington Hotel mattered, you have to understand America in 1928. This was a country sitting on a powder keg. 8 years earlier, the 18th Amendment had outlawed alcohol. What it actually did was outlaw restraint. By 1928, Prohibition had reached its most violent peak. Illegal liquor flowed through every major city in America. Speakeasies operated openly, police were bribed, judges were compromised, politicians were bought. Bootlegging had become a $3 billion underground economy, larger than the federal government's annual budget. And wherever that much money exists, violence follows. Gang wars exploded nationwide. Chicago was bleeding. New York was fragmenting. Detroit, St. Louis, Baltimore, all locked in battles over territory, supply lines, and political protection. In Chicago, Italian gangs fought for control of breweries, trucking routes, and speakeasies. Bodies were found in alleys. Cars were riddled with bullets in daylight. Bombs detonated outside businesses that refused to pay. In New York, Rival organizations clawed at one another for dominance. Jewish, Italian, Irish, each carving out neighborhoods, each enforcing boundaries with gunfire. And then there was Harlem. Harlem didn't just drink, Harlem gambled. The numbers racket, known as the policy game, had become one of the most efficient criminal enterprises in America. Low overhead, daily cash flow, deep community participation. While white gangsters fought wars over liquor shipments, black operators in Harlem quietly generated millions through gambling. And that made Harlem a target. White mobsters wanted in. They paid off police. They launched a slow, brutal war to take over black-controlled territory. But Harlem didn't collapse. It resisted. The violence escalated, but profits fell. The more white gangs tried to muscle in, the more attention they attracted, from police, from politicians, from federal agents. And then the unspoken problem became impossible to ignore. America was rigidly segregated. Black neighborhoods were off-limits socially, but irresistible financially. White gangsters wanted the money, but they didn't understand the systems, didn't understand the community, and couldn't operate there without provoking chaos. Racial segregation wasn't just a social rule, it was enforced by law, custom, and violence. Black Americans were barred from white hotels, white businesses, white political power, and the criminal underworld mirrored that division perfectly. White gangs ruled nationally, black gangs survived locally. That was the assumption. That was the rule. But Prohibition was breaking everything. The scale of the money was too large, the violence too costly, the attention too dangerous. Gangsters were being hunted not just from rivals, but from the federal government. And smart men like Capone, were beginning to realize something uncomfortable. The old rules weren't working anymore. Bootlegging wouldn't last forever. Public support for Prohibition was collapsing, and when it ended, the empires built on alcohol would vanish overnight, which meant the future of organized crime would belong to whoever controlled what came next: gambling, numbers, racketeering. And in those rackets, black neighborhoods were already years ahead. So here was the contradiction tearing at the underworld in 1928. White America refused to integrate. White criminals depended on black money. White gangs could take territory, but not without destroying the profits they wanted. And that raised a question no one wanted to ask out loud. If America wouldn't integrate legally, why would crime do it first? Because somewhere between Chicago, Harlem, and New York, the math was becoming impossible to ignore. And in one guarded room at the Lexington Hotel, someone was finally willing to say it out loud.
By the winter of 1928, Al Capone was 29 years old and already living on borrowed time. From the outside, his empire looked invincible. Bootlegging routes that stretched across the Midwest, speakeasies that never closed, breweries running day and night behind locked doors, cash flowing in so fast it had to be counted in shifts. More than $100 million a year, an illegal fortune unmatched in American history. Capone didn't just control Chicago's alcohol, he controlled its police precincts, its judges, its city officials, the flow of information, the flow of fear. He was young, charismatic, generous in public, ruthless in private. A man who understood optics as well as violence, who built soup kitchens for the poor while ordering executions after dinner. But power has a shadow, and by 1928, that shadow was closing in. Capone that survived the bloodiest year of the Prohibition Wars. Rivals had tried to kill him with bombs hidden in cars, with ambushes outside restaurants, with bullets fired into crowds. He learned to vary his routes, to rotate his bodyguards, to never sit with his back to a door. Every handshake was measured, every smile evaluated, every room entered as if it might be the last. Because being the most powerful gangster in America also meant being the most hunted. and violence, once his greatest weapon, was becoming a liability. Every killing brought headlines, every explosion brought federal attention, every gang war pushed Washington closer to doing what local police would not. The federal government was watching now. Not just Chicago police, not just Cook County prosecutors, but federal agents tracing money, following patterns, building cases that didn't rely on witnesses who could be intimidated or killed. Capone understood something many of his rivals did not. You can shoot a man, you can silence a witness, but you can't shoot an accountant's ledger, and you can't bomb an indictment. By 1928, Capone could feel the pressure tightening, not from rivals, but from the state itself. And there was another problem, one that violence couldn't touch at all. Bootlegging was everything. It was the engine of his empire, the reason his organization existed. But Capone was not a fool. He saw what others refused to admit. Prohibition was failing. Public support was collapsing. Politicians were wavering. The violence was becoming too visible, too embarrassing, too costly. Capone didn't know when it would end, but he knew it would. And when it did, bootlegging would vanish overnight. No liquor routes, no speakeasy monopolies, no illegal supply chains worth killing over. Every gangster in America would be scrambling for what came next. Capone was already thinking about that future: gambling, numbers, racketeering, operations that didn't depend on a constitutional amendment staying in place. And when he looked at those rackets honestly, he saw a problem he couldn't ignore. The most sophisticated gambling systems in America weren't run by Italians. They weren't run by Irish mobs. They weren't run by his own organization. They were run in black neighborhoods, quietly, efficiently, profitably. Places his men couldn't operate without starting wars they didn't understand. Territories they could take, but only by destroying the very profits they wanted. Al Capone had built his empire on force, but now force was producing diminishing returns. More violence meant more attention meant federal intervention, and federal intervention meant the end. So, sitting at the height of his power, Al Capone was facing his limits, not because he was weak, but because the world was changing. And for the first time, the most dangerous threat to Capone wasn't another gunman, it was the future itself. That was the moment he found himself waiting in a private dining room at the Lexington Hotel, not for someone he intended to kill, but someone he might need. Someone who represented a solution he once would have laughed at. A solution that required something Capone had rarely used before: restraint, foresight, and cooperation. Even if it meant crossing a line that no one in America, criminal or otherwise, was supposed to cross. While Chicago bled in the streets, Harlem counted money. In 1928, Harlem was often described by outsiders as chaotic. Crowded tenements, underground clubs, police raids, violence simmering just below the surface. But that image missed the truth. Because beneath the noise, Harlem ran one of the most efficient criminal economies in America. Not bootlegging, not hijacking, not open warfare. Gambling. Specifically, the numbers racket, also known as the policy game. It was simple on the surface. Pick a 3-digit number, bet a few cents, maybe $1. If your number hit, the payout could change your life. But behind that simplicity was a system refined to near perfection. Policy gambling operated daily. No shipments to intercept, no trucks to hijack, no warehouses to raid. Just paper slips, runners, collectors, bookkeepers. Money moved fast. Cash in the morning, payouts by nightfall. Low overhead, minimal violence, and profits so steady they made bootlegging look reckless. Harlem's numbers game didn't rely on intimidation, it relied on participation. Entire neighborhoods played.
Domestic workers, porters, musicians, laborers. Small bets multiplied by tens of thousands of players every single day. And, unlike alcohol, gambling wasn't tied to a constitutional amendment. It didn't require smuggling, it didn't require bribing border agents or corrupting entire supply chains. It simply required trust. Trust that the number would be called fairly, trust that winnings would be paid, trust that the system worked. And in Harlem, it did. The money was cleaner because it didn't come soaked in blood, faster because it turned over daily, smarter because it was decentralized. No single raid could shut it down. White mobsters noticed, and they wanted it. To them, Harlem looked like an open vault, millions flowing through black neighborhoods that white gangs believed should already belong to them. They sent enforcers, they leaned on police, they tried intimidation, assassinations, hostile takeovers. But Harlem didn't fold, because Harlem wasn't disorganized, it was disciplined. At the center of that discipline stood a woman most gangsters underestimated and many would come to regret ignoring: Stephanie St. Clair. Known as Madam Queen, St. Clair was not a street thug, she was a strategist. She understood numbers, law, public relations, and power. She fought white mob encroachment not just with muscle, but with courts, newspapers, and organization. She documented police corruption, filed lawsuits, exposed payoffs, and when violence was unavoidable, she made sure it was targeted, never random, never sloppy. Under her influence, Harlem's numbers operations became something rare in the underworld: stable. White mobs failed to take Harlem because they didn't understand it. They brought guns to a system built on math. They brought force to a business built on routine. They brought chaos into neighborhoods where chaos disrupted profits. Every killing drew attention. Every bombing scared customers. Every raid disrupted daily play. And Harlem's operators knew something the outsiders didn't. If the players stopped betting, everyone lost. So, Harlem adapted. Routes changed daily. Runners memorized numbers. Records were split, duplicated, hidden. Shut down one operation, 3 more kept running. What white mobs saw as weakness, community involvement, was actually Harlem's greatest strength. Because you can't raid a speakeasy, you can seize a brewery, you can't arrest an entire neighborhood. And that's when the stakes shifted. Harlem wasn't a soft target, it was a machine generating millions of dollars a year with less bloodshed, less attention, and more consistency than almost any white-controlled racket in America. By 1928, this truth was becoming impossible to ignore. The future of organized crime didn't belong only to whoever could shoot the fastest, it belonged to whoever could operate the smartest. And Harlem was already living in that future. Which meant the question facing men like Capone was no longer how to take Harlem, but whether trying to take it at all was worth destroying what made it so valuable in the first place.
If Harlem's gambling empire was a machine, then Ellsworth Raymond Johnson was one of its sharpest blades. They called him Bumpy Johnson, a nickname earned not from reputation, but from the knot that rose from the back of his skull after a childhood injury. He was born into violence, raised in a world where survival required intelligence as much as strength. By his early 20s, Johnson had already built a name in Harlem that carried weight, not because he talked loudly, not because he killed recklessly, but because he understood when violence mattered and when it didn't. Bumpy Johnson was dangerous, but not impulsive. Educated, articulate, widely read. A man who could quote poetry one moment and break bones the next. That combination made him rare. In Harlem's underworld, most men specialized in one thing: muscle or numbers, fear or finance. Johnson understood both. He worked enforcement for Harlem's policy operators, but he also learned the business itself, the accounting,
the roots, the collections, the mathematics that turned pennies into millions. And just as importantly, he understood people. He knew how to intimidate without killing, how to negotiate without appearing weak, how to speak to men who expected submission without giving it. That's why when white mob pressure on Harlem reached a breaking point, Stephanie St. Clair chose him. Not her most violent enforcer, not her loudest voice, but her smartest risk. St. Clair knew what was coming. The white mobs weren't going to stop. They had too much money invested, too much pride at stake. Harlem couldn't win a war of attrition against national crime syndicates, not forever. So she made a calculation of her own. If force wouldn't work, maybe diplomacy would. But not just any diplomacy. This required a man who could walk into the lion's den and speak as an equal. Someone young enough to be underestimated, smart enough to exploit it, calm enough to survive it. She sent Bumpy Johnson to Chicago. Not to threaten, not to beg, to negotiate. It was a mission that bordered on insanity. Chicago was not Harlem. Chicago was Al Capone's city. A black gangster walking uninvited into Capone's headquarters would normally be beaten or killed or disappear without explanation. But Johnson didn't arrive uninvited. Word had been sent ahead, back channels used, safe passage promised. Even so, promises meant little in a world built on betrayal. Johnson arrived in Chicago days before the meeting. He was searched, watched, evaluated. Every move logged, every interaction measured. He knew exactly what was at stake. If Capone rejected the deal, Johnson would be lucky to leave the city alive. If Capone felt insulted, Johnson's death would be quick and quiet. If Capone suspected a setup, there would be no body to find. Johnson understood this, and still he walked forward. Because the alternative was worse. A war Harlem couldn't win, a slow bleed of money, men, and control, a future where black criminal operations were swallowed whole. So Bumpy Johnson carried Harlem's proposal across state lines, across racial boundaries, across rules no one was supposed to break. He carried it alone. No entourage, no weapons, no protection except his own composure. Because if this gamble failed, history would never remember his name. And if it succeeded, it would change everything. If Capone said no, Johnson wouldn't leave Chicago alive.
At 9:47 in the morning, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson stepped through the doors of the Lexington Hotel. He did not pause. He did not look around, because in 1928, a black man did not linger inside a white gangster's headquarters, especially not this one. The Lexington Hotel was not just a hotel. It was Al Capone's command center, a place where business decisions were made quietly and mistakes ended loudly. Johnson was stopped immediately, searched once, then searched again. His pockets emptied, his jacket inspected, his shoes checked. No weapons, no notes, no insurance. Just a tailored suit, expensive but restrained, and the composure of a man who understood that panic would look like guilt. Two of Capone's bodyguards flanked him without speaking. Large men, Italian, professional. They didn't threaten him, they didn't rush him, they watched. Johnson was led through silent hallways, past closed doors, up to the fourth floor, where Capone waited. Inside the private dining room, the table was already set. Italian food, expensive wine, crystal glasses catching the morning light. This was Capone's ritual, a reminder of wealth, of control, of hospitality offered from a position of dominance. Capone sat at the head of the table. To his right was Jake Guzik, the organization's financial architect,
the man who spoke to politicians, police captains, and bankers. To his left sat Frank Nitti, the man who handled problems when negotiations failed. Three men who represented money, muscle, and absolute authority. Johnson entered the room alone, and then something happened that should not have. Capone stood. He extended his hand. In 1928 America, white men did not shake hands with black men, not in public, not in private, not under any circumstances that implied equality. But Capone did. It was brief, measured, a gesture that stunned Johnson more than any threat could have. Capone invited him to sit, told him to eat, told them they wouldn't do business on an empty stomach. The room went quiet. No small talk, no introductions, just the sound of cutlery and the awareness that every word spoken next could decide whether Johnson lived or died. Johnson spoke first. He did not flatter. He did not apologize for being there. He delivered Stephanie St. Clair's proposition plainly, a division of territory along racial lines, autonomy for Harlem, tribute instead of war. As he spoke, he did not lower his eyes. That alone was dangerous. Capone listened without interrupting. No jokes, no threats, just calculation. Johnson explained the cost of the Harlem War, the money being burned, the attention being drawn, the lack of progress. Then he did something no one expected. He made it about profit. He described Harlem's numbers operations, $20 million a year after expenses, steady, reliable, and then the number that mattered most, a percentage, a share that required no guns, no raids, no blood, just restraint. Jake Guzik studied the figures. Frank Nitti matched Johnson's face for cracks. None came. Johnson didn't posture. He didn't threaten. He reasoned. And that was the most dangerous thing in the room. Because Capone understood violence, he expected fear. But this was different. This was a young black gangster standing in his headquarters, arguing that cooperation was more profitable than domination, arguing that racial tradition was costing money. And for the first time since Johnson entered the room, Capone smiled. Not warmly, thoughtfully. The room went silent again. Seconds stretched. This was the moment when most men would fill the space with excuses or retreat. Johnson didn't. He waited. What followed was not an argument. It was a redefinition. As Ellsworth Raymond Johnson finished laying out Harlem's position, the room remained still. No shouting, no threats, no sudden violence, just men calculating risk. Johnson had not come to ask for mercy. He had come to propose an exchange, tribute instead of war. Harlem would not challenge white authority. It would acknowledge it, financially. A fixed percentage of profits paid regularly, quietly. In return, Harlem would be left alone. No more white enforcers testing boundaries, no more hostile takeovers disguised as business disputes, no more slow bleed of violence that destroyed profits on both sides. Autonomy. Black-controlled neighborhoods would run their own rackets, their own gambling, their own internal discipline. White organizations would stay out. On paper, it sounded simple. In practice, it was unthinkable. Because this wasn't just a protection arrangement. This was an admission that black criminal organizations were not temporary nuisances, not disposable street gangs, but permanent economic forces worth negotiating with. It violated the deepest assumption of American organized crime, that power flowed only one way. Capone leaned back as the numbers were explained. Harlem's numbers operations didn't depend on trucks or warehouses. They didn't require smuggling routes or bribing customs agents. They depended on repetition, on trust, on math. Money came in every day, small bets multiplied by thousands. Overhead was minimal, risk was contained. And then came the second layer of the proposal: knowledge, not territory, not guns, information. Johnson explained that Harlem's number systems were more advanced than anything most white gangs were running. The accounting methods, the collection networks, the payout structures, they had been refined under pressure, police raids, competition, and community scrutiny. These were systems that could survive disruption. And as Johnson spoke, Capone began to see the larger picture. Bootlegging had built his empire, but it was unstable. Every shipment could be seized, every route compromised, every distillery shut down overnight. Gambling was different. Gambling survived. And then Capone said what no one else in the room had dared to articulate. Prohibition would not last. He didn't know when, but he knew it was coming. Public opinion was turning. Politicians were hedging. The violence was becoming impossible to justify. When the 18th Amendment fell, bootlegging would vanish instantly. Those who hadn't prepared would collapse. Those who had diversified would dominate. Capone wasn't thinking about next year. He was thinking about the next decade. And in that future, the most valuable criminal knowledge in America wasn't how to move liquor. It was how to run numbers. That was the moment the proposal crossed a line. This was no longer about protection money. This was about restructuring power. A national system where black operators ran black territories, white operators collected tribute, information flowed upward, and violence was replaced with predictability. The hierarchy remained, but the chaos ended. For the first time, Capone wasn't being asked to conquer. He was being asked to manage.
Once the decision was made, the violence stopped being the story, and structure took its place. In the days that followed the Lexington Hotel meeting, what Capone and Johnson began building was not an alliance announced with handshakes or headlines. It was a system, quiet, layered, and deliberately invisible. Territory came first. Lines were drawn not on maps, but in understanding. Predominantly black neighborhoods, Harlem, Chicago's South Side, black districts in Detroit, Baltimore, St. Louis would be left to black operators. White gangs would not compete there, would not muscle in, would not test boundaries. In exchange, those territories would never challenge white-controlled districts. No expansion wars, no ambition beyond their lanes. It was segregation enforced not by law, but by profit. Then came tribute, not a vague promise, not an occasional payoff, a fixed percentage, 15% of gross gambling profits paid quarterly, not net, not after expenses, off the top. It was lower than Harlem had initially offered, but more important than the number was what it represented: predictability. The money arrived on schedule, in cash, counted, verified, and laundered through channels Capone already controlled. No need for collectors to break doors down, no need for threats. Miss a payment and protection disappeared, and everyone understood what that meant. Protection was the third pillar. Capone's organization did not run black operations, it shielded them. White gangs were warned, through intermediaries, through silence, through reputation, that certain neighborhoods were off limits. Police pressure eased, raids became predictable, warnings traveled faster than warrants. And when disputes arose, they were handled internally by the side that violated the agreement. That mattered. Punishment came from within, not across racial lines, which kept conflicts from escalating into wars. At the center of it all stood Ellsworth Raymond Johnson. No title, no public authority, but functionally he became something unprecedented, a national liaison. Operating out of Chicago, Johnson coordinated between Capone's organization and black gambling operators across the country. He carried messages, resolved disputes, explained rules. He was trusted because he understood both worlds. He spoke the language of Harlem, and now he understood the logic of Chicago. And with that understanding came stability. The shooting slowed, then stopped. The Harlem War that had drained money and drawn attention quietly ended, not with a victory parade, but with silence. Dutch Schultz and other white operators backed off, not because they were defeated, but because the cost no longer made sense. Money stabilized, gambling profits became reliable, predictable, quarterly. Capone's organization gained millions without firing a shot. Black operators gained autonomy without constant fear of invasion. The streets grew calmer, not safer, but quieter, because chaos is bad for business. What emerged was something new, not a loose network of gangs, not constant warfare over corners, but management. Territories respected, revenue streams diversified, risk minimized. Crime began to resemble a corporation. Hierarchy, departments, defined roles. Violence was no longer the primary tool, it became the last resort. And that was the real transformation. Not cooperation across racial lines, but the replacement of instinct with infrastructure. This was no longer about who could kill the fastest. It was about who could run the system most efficient.
What made the arrangement powerful was the same thing that kept it invisible. No contracts were signed, no meetings were announced, no photographs were taken. There were no minutes, no letters, no memoranda. Because for everyone involved, talking about it was more dangerous than denying it ever happened. For white bosses, the risk was existential. Publicly acknowledging cooperation with black criminal organizations would have shattered the racial hierarchy that protected their power. Italian bosses relied on politicians, judges, and police officials who upheld segregation as a social order. Those relationships depended on appearances. A white gangster who openly treated black criminals as partners risked losing political protection overnight. Bribes would dry up, doors would close, enemies would smell weakness. Worse still, rivals could use it as leverage, as proof that a boss was violating the unspoken racial rules of the underworld. In a world where reputation was everything, that kind of exposure could get a man killed. For black operators, the risk was just as severe, but different. Public knowledge of the arrangement could make them targets. Other black gangs might see them as collaborators, as sellouts paying tribute to white bosses. White gangs outside the arrangement could justify violence by claiming betrayal. Police could intensify crackdowns if they suspected coordination between racial groups. And then there were the politicians. Segregation was not just social policy, it was political currency. The idea that white and black criminals were quietly cooperating for profit threatened the narrative that racial separation was natural, necessary, and stable. If the public learned that criminals had crossed those lines successfully, it raised questions no one in power wanted asked. So the silence was mutual. White bosses said nothing to protect their legitimacy. Black operators said nothing to protect their autonomy. And the people in the middle, men like Johnson, learned quickly that survival depended on discretion. The system was enforced not by documents, but by consequences. Those who violated the arrangement were punished internally, quietly, without spectacle, which meant there were no public trials, no testimony, no records for historians to find decades later. And that's why, for so long, historians missed it. Traditional crime history focused on Italian-American organizations, on bootlegging, on headline-grabbing violence.
Black organized crime was treated as peripheral, small, local, disorganized. Financial records were fragmented, witnesses were dead, participants had every incentive to forget. The arrangement didn't leave a paper trail because it couldn't afford one. Its strength was its invisibility. For more than 40 years, it worked because it stayed unspoken. Not a conspiracy, a mutual understanding, an agreement protected by fear, profit, and shared interest. That's why you won't find it in court transcripts or police files or official histories. You find it only in patterns, in wars that suddenly ended, in territories that stopped changing hands, in money that kept flowing without explanation, because the most powerful deal in crime history left no paperwork.
The true test of any criminal arrangement isn't how it begins, it's what happens when power disappears. In 1931, the unthinkable happened. Al Capone, the most powerful gangster in America, was convicted not for murder, not for bootlegging, not for conspiracy, but for tax evasion. The kingpin who had survived bullets and bombs was brought down by paperwork. Capone was sentenced to federal prison, and to many observers it should have been the end. An empire built around one man rarely survives his removal. Most criminal organizations collapse into violence the moment leadership is taken away. But that didn't happen, because by the time Capone went to prison, the most important thing he had built wasn't his bootlegging empire, it was the structure underneath it. Leadership passed quietly to Frank Nitti. Operations continued, tribute still arrived on schedule, and the arrangements with black gambling operations, the agreements born in silence at the Lexington Hotel, remained intact. That was the proof. This wasn't a personality-driven deal, it was institutional. When national Italian-American crime families reorganized in the early 1930s, they formalized many of the same principles Capone had already put into practice: territorial boundaries, profit sharing, dispute resolution without violence. The commission, created to coordinate Italian crime families nationally, absorbed the logic of the system. Each family controlled its territory, wars were discouraged, revenue streams were protected, and within those territories, the arrangements with black operators were respected, not advertised, not debated, but enforced, because they worked. Meanwhile, Ellsworth Raymond Johnson returned to Harlem, and he did not return as a foot soldier. He returned with protection no one could see, but everyone understood. Johnson was no longer just a Harlem enforcer, he was a power broker. He had relationships that crossed cities, crossed organizations, crossed racial lines that most men never approached. White gangs knew attacking him risked retaliation far beyond Harlem. Black gangs knew crossing him meant isolation from protection that mattered. That made him untouchable, not invincible, but insulated. Under the new order, black organized crime entered a period of relative stability. The constant threat of white takeover receded. Gambling operations expanded. Money stayed in black neighborhoods instead of being extracted through endless wars. Numbers rackets flourished through the 1930s and 40s. Cash flow became predictable. Violence became selective rather than constant. This stability allowed something rare: accumulation. Capital could be reinvested. Loans could be made. Businesses, legal and illegal, could be sustained. In communities where legitimate banks refused service, the underground economy filled the gap. All of it rested on a foundation built quietly in 1928. And that is the most overlooked consequence of the Capone-Johnson arrangement. It outlived Capone. It survived leadership changes, federal prosecutions, economic shifts, because it wasn't built on loyalty, it was built on incentives. Profit over pride, order over chaos, silence over spectacle. Power didn't disappear when Capone went to prison. It redistributed. And in that redistribution, American organized crime changed permanently, becoming less visible, more disciplined, and far more durable. The aftermath proved what the meeting at the Lexington Hotel had set in motion. The structure held, and history moved forward without ever writing it down.
The most convincing proof that the arrangement worked is how long it lasted. Not months, not years, decades. Through the 1930s, 40s, 50s, and well into the 1970s, the basic understanding forged in silence during Prohibition continued to shape the American underworld. It was never announced, never celebrated, never written down, but it endured. As Prohibition ended in the early 1930s, bootlegging collapsed almost overnight. The liquor routes dried up, the speakeasies went legal, the violence that had defined the era faded from headlines. And yet organized crime did not disappear, it adapted. Gambling became the backbone. Numbers rackets, especially in black neighborhoods, flourished. Daily betting, low visibility, reliable cash flow. In Harlem, on Chicago's South Side, in Detroit, Baltimore, and other urban centers, policy gambling became a permanent fixture of underground life. The structure held. Black operators controlled their territories. Italian families collected tribute quietly. Disputes were managed, not fought. The streets were not peaceful, but they were predictable. That predictability mattered. For nearly 40 years, the system provided stability in a criminal world that normally devoured itself. Men came and went, leaders were arrested, others died, but the arrangement outlived individuals. It survived because it was useful. By the 1940s and 50s, numbers gambling had grown so entrenched that it became part of everyday life in many black communities. It financed businesses, provided informal loans, supported families who had no access to legitimate credit. At the same time, Italian-American crime families used the steady income to diversify further. Labor racketeering, construction, unions, political influence. The machine ran quietly. But nothing lasts forever. By the 1960s, the economics of crime began to change. Gambling was still profitable, but drugs were transformative. Heroin entered urban markets on a scale gambling could never match. The profits were larger, the risks higher, the structure looser. Drug trafficking didn't require community participation. It didn't depend on trust. It thrived on addiction. And that difference mattered. The old system, built on routine, restraint, and predictable payments, was poorly suited to a new generation of criminals who had no memory of prohibition, no loyalty to old arrangements, and no patience for tribute. Younger gangs operated independently. They didn't ask permission. They didn't pay percentages. They didn't respect territorial boundaries drawn decades earlier. As heroin and later other drugs replaced gambling as the most lucrative criminal enterprise, the logic of the old system began to erode. But it did not explode. There was no final war, no dramatic collapse. The arrangement faded, quietly. Tribute payments became irregular. Protection became less relevant. The old intermediaries retired, died, or lost influence. By the 1970s, the criminal underworld looked nothing like it had in 1928. The commission weakened. Federal prosecutions intensified. Independent drug organizations rose outside the old hierarchy. And yet the long shadow remained. For nearly half a century, the structure created in that guarded hotel room had reduced violence, stabilized profits, and reshaped how crime operated in America. It didn't end in blood. It ended in irrelevance. Outpaced by new economics, new crimes,
new generations who never knew why the rules existed in the first place. That is the final irony. One of the most durable systems in criminal history didn't collapse under pressure, it simply aged out of the future. And when it disappeared, it left behind almost no trace. No documents, no signatures, just patterns, and a silence that lasted long enough for most of the world to forget it ever existed.
When people remember Al Capone, they remember the violence, the machine guns, the headlines, the bodies. But that wasn't his greatest talent. Capone's true genius wasn't brutality, it was recognition. The ability to see when force stopped working and when cooperation paid better. At the height of his power, when he could have tried to crush Harlem through endless war, Capone chose restraint. Not out of morality, out of calculation. He understood that the future of organized crime did not belong to whoever spilled the most blood. It belonged to whoever could build systems that survived change. And for that future, he needed something he didn't have: knowledge, access, stability. That is where Bumpy Johnson enters the story, not as a conqueror, but as a negotiator. Johnson's power never came from commanding armies or controlling cities. It came from standing between worlds that were never supposed to meet. He survived because he understood something rare in the underworld, that respect could be engineered, that violence could be delayed, that silence could be more powerful than fear. Johnson didn't win by defeating Capone. He won by convincing him. Together, quietly, invisibly, they helped create a structure that did what American society refused to do at the time. It integrated. Not socially, not legally, but economically. While the country enforced segregation with laws and customs, the underworld crossed those lines for profit. It acknowledged reality, recognized efficiency, and adapted. White criminal organizations gained stability and long-term revenue. Black criminal organizations gained autonomy and protection. The hierarchy remained, the inequality remained, but the chaos ended. And that is why history struggled to see it. This story doesn't fit the narrative we're comfortable with. It doesn't frame crime as simple brutality or segregation as absolute. It shows something more unsettling, that criminals, operating entirely outside the law, were sometimes quicker to adapt than the society chasing them. The deal was never written down because it couldn't be. It lived only in behavior, patterns, and silence. And silence protected everyone involved. For decades, the arrangement held. It shaped neighborhoods, stabilized empires, and influenced the very structure of organized crime that followed, until it faded, not in a war, not in a scandal, but quietly as the world moved on. What remains is not proof, but implication, that in a country divided by race, the underworld found unity, not through justice, but through profit.